All right. Hello. We are going live for weekly office hours. We got a lot of stuff to dive into. As we're waiting for everybody to start pouring through, one thing that we really wanted to dive deeper into is like mins and maxes, right? Minimums and maximums. How you go about setting those is super important and sometimes very counterintuitive. So, Casey, is there anything you wanted to like highlight before we like really hit the ground running on that?
Nothing to highlight about it in general. I mean, I think it's a really important conversation to have. Obviously, your mins and max have a direct correlation to how Aura can reprice your items, your margins, profits, and all of that, and maybe different scenarios and where you maybe want to use max prices, don't want to use max prices. And I know a lot of our customers have a lot of different platforms where they have min and maxes set and maybe wondering what's red and what's not. So yeah, I think it'll be a good conversation to get us started here.
Yeah. There can be a lot of complexities where you have multiple softwares where you're setting these. What we tend to recommend is only set those in your repricing tool. Why? Because most of the time, those are not being synced. They are not being considered. So a good example here is if you're setting your mins and maxes in Seller Central, as well as Aura, you could have some issues. And so what we've realized over the years is by not setting them in Seller Central, you don't lose anything and you gain a lot more flexibility and basically like you avoid a lot of potential problems, right? Like, potential high pricing errors, low pricing errors. Basically, like the issue comes down to both tools being blind to one another's mins and max values. And so, if you're just super keen on keeping your mins and maxes in Seller Central, that is fine. Just make sure that you have your mins and maxes in Aura tighter than they are in Seller Central. That way we never go outside of those Seller Central bounds. It could be simply by a penny. Maybe, penny's pretty good. Now, when you get into mins and maxes, just as a concept, why do they exist? They're very important, right? Because you're essentially giving a lot of autonomy to software to update your price. So naturally, you want to say, hey, don't go super low. Don't lose me money, right? Like this is super important. We wrote a whole blog post on how to avoid price tanking and like kind of setting the stage for what price tanking really is. And when it's not that case, but seems that way. So what I've always recommended is you should automatically set your min prices using your cost, right? That's looking at things like your ROI, you're looking at profit margin, fixed profit even, and you should set your max prices manually, but there's a caveat to this that recently changed. Why set these automatically? Because a lot of times you're making bulk changes, meaning your minimums that you're willing to accept in Q1 versus Q4 can be vastly different. You might be willing to accept only 30% ROI in Q4, but in Q1, things slow down. You're willing to go down to 15% ROI. So it allows you to make major like account-wide, listing-wide changes with one change in your settings, right? Additionally, it's factoring in things that change. Your costs can change. The fees can change. And so by allowing Aura to automatically set these, we're able to be more flexible, right? So if you're manually setting your min prices, you could accidentally set it in a reduced profit range, which causes you to lose money. Whereas Aura is going to say, hey, that's a reduced profit range. I'm going to adjust myself. Or the fees recently changed quite a bit. Okay, well now your profitable min is no longer profitable. Right? That can go up, it can go down. But the issue with max prices is it has nothing to do with your cost, right? It has everything really to do with the economics of the SKU itself. And those change, right, all the time. So really it should be dynamic, which means, I mentioned that you should manually set those with the caveat. Here's the caveat. The better way to do this is to allow a system like Maven, the way we do this, factor in a few different scenarios and variables and have it adjust in real time. So we have something called Dynamic Max that basically adjusts itself on the fly. So every time a price change comes through, we're asking ourselves, should that change, right? Should it be higher, lower? It really depends, right? If we see that we're suppressing the buy box super high, great. We need to adjust down. If we know that the demand recently increased and the buy box is actually getting really close to that max value, we probably need to increase that. And so what's nice is you kind of get the best of both worlds when you're using something like Maven, where you can say, great, 15% ROI minimum, you handle that, all the math for me. And then that max dynamically adjusts as we need to. It's so important because that flexibility does matter and allows you to be more accurate in terms of how those things are being done. So super, super important there. But is there anything that I didn't cover, Casey, you think we should hear?
I think one thing that's important to highlight is if you are doing your auto or your mins and maxes auto calculated by Aura, want to make sure those costs are accurate. So if you are an FBM seller, making sure you include any shipping fees for those listings on those costs.
Mhm.
And then for anyone who may be using Maven, I know max prices aren't necessarily required in Aura for Maven to work properly. If that is the case, you'll want to remove those max prices in Seller Central. That'll avoid any listings being deactivated due to a potentially high pricing error, things of that nature. So those are just the two things I've seen come up in support for some folks recently. Definitely a quicker fix, but yeah, I recommend having them be auto calculated. That'll save you kind of the monotonous time of going through all your listings, making sure those mins and maxes are at a good point, or a good point right now. And moving forward, having them auto calculated will take into account those fee adjustments and things that you mentioned. So we'll kind of make the lift a little bit easier moving forward for you as well.
Yeah, good call out. You can definitely override the dynamic max for whatever reason. Sometimes you need to, right? We're trying to build things to where the default is the best solution. However, there's always exceptions, so you can kind of override wherever you need to. Even within Maven, you have some configurations you can uncheck, like the suppress buy box as an example. Maven will by default just handle that for you. There are some cases where you don't want to unsuppress a buy box, funny enough. So you can go in and kind of configure that as you need. So super, super cool there. Cool question from Tony here, kind of in line with the Maven conversation we're having. Let's say I have a product selling 100 times a month. I have 100 units in stock. Buy box is $20, but I would rather sell for $25. I have my range set up for $20 to $25. Will Maven sell me out completely as possible at 20, or will it cycle back and forth to get some sales at 25? I can't say yes or no because it depends. So it really depends on where, Maven looks for something called the optimal price. This is a price that we calculate in real time. It is the balance between sales velocity and profitability. That changes a lot, right? So it's hard to say exactly what it would do because there's a lot of variables. And I think this is what's important about highlighting Maven's complexity. It's hard to say this is exactly what's going to happen because what's your competition doing, right? Where's the optimal price? Where's the dynamic max price? Because the dynamic could actually be 32, and that makes a lot of sense, right? So it really depends on where that optimal price is. That's where Maven's going to really start to target. If the optimal price is that 25, definitely. With that said, though, it will intentionally try to increase the buy box. I think this is super important to highlight. Just because the buy box sits at 20 doesn't mean you can't get sales higher than that. We routinely, you see this on Twitter and other social platforms. People talk about Maven essentially getting sales higher. I think it was 2 blog posts ago where we basically highlighted this, talking about price tanking. Actually, we're talking about Maven, how Maven handles price tanking, and it really avoids it. And one of the things we looked at was a Twitter post that somebody said, "Hey, here's a sale that I got at like $66, and then a little bit later at $90." They didn't change anything. They're using Maven, right? So now you have to ask your question: well, what changed to allow that to occur? It could be a handful of different things. One of those could be the optimal price increased, in which case, the price went up. It could have been that Maven was intentionally testing upper bounds and got a sale there. And great, that's good data. So it depends, right? I love these questions. There's never like a clear, easy, like exactly what's going to happen because this is, again, highlighting the complexities of being a seller. There are so many additional variables, attributes, what have you, that get factored into Maven than just saying like, hey, what's it going to do here? It's like, I kind of need more information because there's a lot there for sure. Great question though. Keep these questions coming. There's a lot of people pouring in here. Any questions you have related to selling, you have related to Aura, we can definitely dive deeper, share screen too. If there's anything you're like, how do I do this in Aura? Or, I kind of have this big question, or even little things, we're happy to help here. This is a time for us in office hours to be able to dive deeper, kind of open-ended, which is awesome. But Tony, great question. Hopefully that kind of shed a little light as to what would happen in that situation, as best we can, of course. And I'm going to tease a little bit here. There's a lot of cool things in the works behind the scenes that are coming up. Had 2 pretty awesome conversations today. So a lot of really cool stuff coming your way, a lot of new functionality that we're very excited about. So we're moving really fast on a lot right now. But yeah, good stuff. Casey, is there anything else that's like really high level for you that you've noticed patterns? I know we were talking, mins and maxes there, but anything else that's really been coming up for you?
Nothing Nothing specific seems to be a common trend right now. It's exciting to see a lot of new users getting on board and having those
Yeah.
getting started questions, trying to point them in the right direction. Hey, what's your setup like? Maybe let's set a strategy up for this or that. Um, a lot of folks having questions like, hey, I have some FBM, some FBA listings. What do you
Mhm.
recommend here? So nothing outside of the usual. And for anyone who does have sort of a mixed catalog of FBA and FBM, depending on what you're looking to do, I sometimes recommend having one strategy for each. Obviously, FBA can probably be priced a little bit lower than FBM in some situations. So not wanting to compete against FBA listings with an FBM listing, vice versa. So just helping people get set up with the different nuances depending on their situation. But yeah, no immediate trends come to mind. I'm glad we covered some of that min max price. That tends to be
Yeah.
where people are getting started. They want to make sure, hey, if Aura is only going to obey these bounds, how do I set them in the best way possible? So I think that was a good topic to jump into today.
Yeah. Nice. Tony has another question here. I have the plan where I get 50 Maven listings. If I drop some listings off Maven to add new/other ones, is there a delay? Is there a delay in terms of getting those applied and getting up and running? No, because the moment you add Maven, the replay system kicks on and says, great, what do I need to do here? So Maven kicks off immediately, especially if you're using the Hyperdrive feature on a particular listing while applying Maven. We're able to move really, really fast. So, could be anywhere from less than 10 seconds that you get your next price change with those change settings. Could be a little bit longer if you're not using Hyperdrive. But no, yeah, there's really no delay in terms of Maven being up and running the moment you apply to it. We immediately look at the most recent offer change information and say, great, based on what's happening here, let's start to test some stuff. Now, Maven, I will say, can take a little bit of time to essentially get up and running, meaning it's learning your competition, right? So on really competitive listings, that honestly could be a few price changes and we know exactly what's happening. We're good here. On really non-competitive ones, it could take a little bit longer. I've rarely seen it go over a day of testing to really like figure out what it wants to do. But give it a little bit of time there to kind of run some experiments, understand what's happening, and then start to adapt itself and evolve. But no, that should be relatively fast. Great question, Cheryl. Yes, great question. Is it best to set our min, max in Seller Central or in Inventory Lab? I actually don't recommend either. It actually makes more sense, especially if you're jumping in late. We covered this at the beginning. This is super important. So I definitely want to re-highlight this is you should set your min prices automatically using your strategy, which factors in your costs and fees and all that stuff. The reason for that is you get to make bulk changes. So if all your SKUs are using the same strategy and you want to go from 15 to 30% ROI in one click, you do that in the strategy level. Now your max prices are different. This is where we really recommend Maven because Maven basically says like, don't worry about it. I got it for you. Like I'll just do that for you. So we have something called dynamic max that's actually factoring in a few different variables. Now you can override that if you want. Sometimes you kind of need to. But what's nice there is you're not setting it in multiple places. And, even in Inventory Lab, I really don't see the value in adding it there because you're not using it, right? I always come back to like, when is the data being used? When's the information being used? And like Seller Central doesn't use it outside of creating problems, let's be honest. And Inventory Lab is not really using it outside of possibly, passing it somewhere else. So I would actually recommend that you don't do that and really keep all that information stored in Aura. That way, you avoid a lot of potential pitfalls, issues, what have you, errors, and Aura is really using that to its advantage. See Prince here. Does Maven have a different approach when repricing used items? Like, does its algorithm factor in completely different things as opposed to new items? Great question. Yes. So Maven does understand who's what offer, right? Like, are you new going against used? Are you used going against new, right? All that. So it does factor that in, which is awesome, right? Because again, this allows Maven to be far more flexible in terms of the scenarios it can handle. Ideally, what we're trying to build here is something that you can say, hey, here's a listing, go figure it out. And it's like, cool, I got you. And we can self-adapt from there. Casey, anything you want to add on to that?
No, yeah, it will recognize obviously if you're competing with used, new versus used versus new. So I think it'll really just act on that listing as it would for any other listing, really focusing on your competition, how they're repricing and adjusting, looking for that balance between margin and velocity. So it will recognize that you're selling a used item, but its logic doesn't really change. It's more so just who it's continuing to observe as that competition. So yeah, definitely would still recommend using Maven in those situations.
Awesome. See Cheryl here. Thank you. That sounds great. I'm brand new to repricing in just the small seller program. Awesome. Yeah, very welcome. We're excited to have you on. Happy to have you jump into office hours as well and learn. Repricing can feel slightly overwhelming at first. So we're hoping we can reduce that friction and overwhelm and really make you a power user. See, Tony has a follow-up here on the 50 listings. Okay, and change it to where I have 45 listings. I want to add 5 additional new listings, but I am locked. Lock icon will not let me change. Yeah, reach out to Casey and Finn and support Tony in that bottom right. It depends on how it's being done. But if you're toggling those off and you're under the 50, you should be able to add those additional 5. If not, definitely reach out and let us know, and we can take a deeper dive.
Yeah, my first thought there for you, Tony, is you may have some listings who went out of stock that still have Maven applied to them. So then you would be showing 45 active listings. So if you're on your listings page, you can toggle that. I believe it's next to the add filter from active to all. And then you might be able to see some active or excuse me, inactive or out of stock listings that may have Maven still applied there.
Yeah, totally. Also, if you are getting started and have a bunch of questions, obviously reach out to us. We're definitely very much readily available. We do have support documentation that I think is pretty good. We try to answer all the questions. Here's how you get set up. Here's what this means. Here's what that means. Here's some best practices. I think, whenever you're getting started with a new software, you really need to understand what are the best practices here, right? Because every software has some type of bias or opinionation in terms of how it was designed or built. And so understanding really what's the best flow here? How should workflows be used with my listings? What's the use cases here? And also not just, what is the feature, but how do I use it to get the most? What's the most common usage here? So we have a lot of that, help.goaura.com. It's searchable. It's fantastic. It's also accessible via the chat icon in the bottom right. So that blue icon, if you click that, you can actually search directly there. Or you can even ask a question in our system. We'll try to find an answer via those docs as well. Definitely a lot of good stuff there. Keep these questions coming. These are really awesome. I like that we're diving deeper into some cool stuff here. One thing that as we're waiting for more questions to come through, I really like to highlight is managing your listings. It can be overwhelming. There's a lot of data. And so one of the major things we changed was allowing you to essentially customize how you view your listings. So let me pull this up here and I'll show you guys exactly what I'm talking about. Share my screen.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see how you have your listings organized. Mine's a little bit different in support, so I get the quick snapshot of a few things I'm looking for. But
totally. Okay, cool. So I got 2 listings here. Yeah. So you have this horizontal scroll thing. I actually don't have that. I'm attempting to horizontally scroll now. The reason for that is I have changed exactly what I want to see. So if we click the plus icon here, I can basically say what columns I want to see, which ones I want to hide, and in what order I want to see them. So there's a lot here, right? For me though, there are things I don't like. I really don't look at margin. I don't care about margin. Profit, less important at this level, this high level view, this surface level view. Imported on, I'm not worried about. Fees, kind of important. We could probably get rid of that though too. Rank doesn't really matter. Again, I'm subjectively speaking how I'm viewing things, right? I would actually probably switch rank for fees if I'm being honest. Fulfilled by, if you only do FBA, you don't really need to see if it's FBA or not, right? It's kind of redundant at that point if it's always the same thing. So I would probably get rid of that. Status, I think, is very important. If you only do used FBA, again, condition doesn't really matter. If you're using Maven as an example, and it's dynamically calculating all your max prices, do you really care? Probably not. Not at this level. It's not that you don't care about this data. It's in what context do you really care about, right? So if I'm looking at a specific SKU and I'm going deep on that, I do care. Min price, I think, does make sense because these are things that I can change, right? I may want to override that automatically calculated min price. Sometimes you need to. Cost, you don't really change that here, right? And if you're using an integration that's automatically calculating and pulling these in, Again, don't really worry too much about it. Strategy, important because I want to be able to change that on the fly. Hyperdrive, very much the same thing, right? Repricing, I want to be able to toggle these things as quickly as possible from the surface level. My current price, kind of important, and the buy box price, right? Like, where am I at? Am I in the buy box, out of the buy box? What's my price relative to the buy box? Again, I'm trying to, like, the way I view this is I want to be able to quickly scan and see what are the settings, be able to make changes on the fly if I need to without having to go in depth, click through or anything like that, and just see kind of how are things going. If I need to go deeper, I can click into that SKU and go deeper. So, SKU ASIN name, these are already wrapped up in the listing column. So that's kind of packed in there, which is really nice. Inventory age, you may really care about that. You may not. ROI quantity, again, if you're only selling on the US marketplace, you don't need to have the marketplace column. Pretty straightforward, right? So for me, this is like a really good structure where I have the listing, quantity, ROI, buy box, my price, repricing, hyperdrive strategy, min price, status, and rank. I feel like with these, one, I don't have to do any horizontal scrolling, but I'm also just seeing very quickly all the things I can change and some important metrics that I care about, right? What's my quantity? Because I might show 10. Oh, look, this explains why my price is not at the buy box, because they're pending transfer. It makes sense. How's my ROI doing? Especially if you're pegging that, if like your expectations are really like, I want at least 20% ROI, great. If you see anything less than 20% ROI, we probably need to fix that. And what's nice is we can fix that relatively easy. I might need to, increase my min price or change my strategy. So hopefully that helps in terms of like how to really tweak and customize your listings view in a way that gets the things that you don't care about out of the way, so you can really focus in and prioritize. When we designed this, it took a lot because we talked to a bunch of users and everybody's so different in what they care about, right? Some people don't care about ROI. They care about margin more. Great. Swap those out, right? So customize this to you and what you really care about. But this kind of structure I've found is really, really helpful, right? It really helps you move fast, make changes on the fly, right? Like, let's say I wanted to change all my Yeti stuff, right? I would search for Yeti. Here it is. Boom, boom, boom. I can move on and I'm done. So, I think a lot of software packs in all the data without you being able to say, here's what I prioritize, here's what I care about, and everything else can go away until I need it. So that's like a major thing for us that we really wanted to highlight. So hopefully that helps. But Casey, anything I could like add clarity to on that?
No, I think you pretty much covered it. And that's definitely one of the views that I recommend to our users. I use a similar view. I do have max price in there just to quickly check some things. And though you are correct about the marketplace not being important, one thing that does give you is if you click on the marketplace icon next to that specific listing, it will bring you right to that Amazon listing page. So if that's something that's going to be helpful for folks, I recommend keeping that active so then you can kind of take out some clicks in terms of, having to go to the SKU page and then go to the Amazon listing. So if you're looking for kind of a quick link there, that'll be the best way to do that.
Yeah, great highlight there. If you're finding yourself wanting to jump over to the specific listing on Amazon, I would say add that. And even that, actually, funny enough, adding that, I still don't have any horizontal scroll. So we're all good here, which is nice, right? So that's what's nice is like these have different widths, right? So how you can kind of sequence these, order these. We actually just added one more column that I would say, to your point, very useful without adding any horizontal scroll. So that's great. Yeah, great highlight. Nice. Cool. So to do a few questions here. Let's see, Tony, can you briefly explain suppressed listings? Or says that they are suppressed, but when I check them on Amazon, they are not. Does this mean the price is just higher than Aura/Amazon once? Casey, you want to take that on?
Yeah, so a listing becomes suppressed. And when it's talking about the listing becoming suppressed, it's not the entire listing itself. It's specifically that buy box. So that recommended seller or recommended price that you see on an Amazon listing when you go to a specific page there. So essentially, a buy box will be suppressed on a listing when Amazon deems all the current offers for that listing are too high. Unfortunately, there's no exact silver bullet or formula as to where that threshold is determined by Amazon. That's purely on their end. So that's what that's going to mean when you see a suppressed icon in your account. It's not going to be for the whole listing, just that specific buy box. And there are a couple ways you can combat this. There's a strategy setting where you can have Aura try to slowly lower your price to try and reactivate that buy box, working towards your min. And then Maven will also operate in a similar manner, incrementally dropping that price, trying to reactivate it. But if your min is reached first, Aura obviously won't price below your min, in which case that buy box would remain suppressed in that scenario. So not necessarily the whole listing, more so focused on the buy box being suppressed there.
Yeah. This is super important to highlight. You have suppressed listings, suppressed buy boxes, and your listing, your offer could be made inactive. So those are like the three major things to kind of be aware of. Yeah, great highlights there. Yeah, so it's kind of important to know what specifically we're talking about. But if you're seeing that really in Aura, you're going to see a suppressed buy box. So if you're seeing suppressed, that means the buy box itself. So you'll still see the listing, but no buy box, in which case Amazon's basically telling you your price is too high on average, like all of them. So yeah, Maven's designed to do that by default. You can uncheck that because there are exceptions, right? There are times when you actually don't want to unsuppress a buy box because, we always think about things like, again, you kind of have two levers to pull here. You have velocity and profitability. Maven's designed to find that balance, right? But there are times when when a buy box is suppressed, but the demand, the velocity, yes, it went down, but it's still good enough, and your profit is able to still be high. That you're like, you know what? I got 5 units. I'm going to move it slower, of course, but at this high of a profitability, I'm still moving some of them. I'm willing to take that. So something to kind of be aware of, there's no perfect, here's how to handle every situation, right? Again, we always try to highlight this. Like there's a lot of nuance to managing your SKUs, especially from a pricing perspective. And you should really weigh the math, right? Weigh the options here, right? One of my favorite classes in college was managerial accounting, where you're really like looking at, okay, option A, option B, do the math. Which one makes the most sense here? And what do we care about? You kind of have to do that too. Sometimes that's not super easy to do where you're like, great, like, okay, the buy box went here. What does that velocity mean? How many competitors are there? Based on that, how many less am I going to move because the buy box isn't there? Right? Like there's a lot to there. And so like for me, I'm simple. I personally would just be like, just unsuppress it. And like, let's get moving on here. Because that can add up a ton of time. Right. And you kind of have to weigh like the value of your time in doing that, which could be, $50 extra versus spending it on something more impactful, like buying more inventory, which could have made you $500 more. So a lot of different ways you kind of have to think about this, which highlights again that subtle nuance of being a seller, which is just filled with complexities.
Yeah.
So
yeah, if there was a silver bullet, we would have written an article about it and given it to you folks. But unfortunately, it's not that simple.
We would have written the code. That's for sure. Not quite there yet. But yeah, great questions so far. Keep those rolling through. Tony, you're on a roll and I love it. We just released a blog post as well. I'll get that pulled up for everyone. So again, we're doing weekly blog posts now. Really kind of me pontificating to a degree about kind of the future of being a seller. I'm going to get this added here for everyone to see. There we go. Perfect. That's the URL for it. Or you can just go to /blog. It's the first one there. But really highlighting a post I wrote in 2018, I think it was December 2018, where I was really theorizing like, what is the future of being a seller like? And I really leaned into two things, which was automation and robotics. The robotics side, really looking at like your prep centers, kind of seeing what Amazon was doing in their fulfillment centers with the Kiva systems. They have these systems, these like flat robots essentially that can move these pillars of inventory around. So rather than the human moving around, the inventory moves itself to the human, which is mind-boggling. It's really cool. But I really saw that the cost of robotics getting cheaper over time, and then therefore eventually making its way to prep centers, which means it should get cheaper per unit, and the volume that a prep center can take should be much higher, right? Because prep centers are really limited based on human labor and process. So that's one. And then automation, really leaning more so on like rigid automation, like rule-based, right? Like really like Zapier.com, Make.com. And like a lot of that's still true. You can still automate a ton of stuff. But what I dove into in this blog post was how it's really AI and robotics. But robotics has changed because it's not like these, I'm going to move your carts around. Like there's humanoid robotics, and I highlight companies in both of these spaces that are really making this possible, as like an example. And I think you will get to a point very soon where you do have humanoid robotics in warehouse facilities where sometimes it makes sense. Most of the time, it doesn't make sense to use a humanoid, like they look like us, bipedal kind of thing. But a lot of our world is built for and designed for that kind of function. So I think you'll start to see a lot of that come through because they're going to get cheap enough, and it's going to make a lot of sense. You can depreciate them. You can buy them for $100 grand. They last, 10 years. You can depreciate it over 10, whatever. And then like on the AI side, really looking at like AI based agents. I tout this a lot, but I think very soon you will transition from having virtual assistants sourcing for you to AI based assistants sourcing for you, because VAs really move information around on the internet. That's all. Like if we're being really simplistic here, that's what they're doing. And so could AI agents do that? Yeah, they could. They got to be built for these specific tasks, but yeah, definitely possible. It's a good read. It's a short read. I didn't want to go super in depth and get into the weeds there because there's a lot, but I really talked about like those transitions and what I think every seller should kind of be aware of and start to think about like, cool, like how would this world change? Maybe you can get at the forefront of that because that early on will be a competitive advantage, right? If you can spin up, if somebody's trying to hire 10 VAs, that's going to take a lot of time, a lot of training, a lot of issues. But if you need to spin up 30 new sourcing agents, that's just code. You can do that kind of overnight and it would not cost a ton. We're talking like pennies per hour, not dollars per hour. So, the cheap VA in the Philippines from, $4 to $6 per hour might not be as competitive anymore. Right? The economics of being a seller is really changing, right? Imagine when your prep cost at a prep center goes from, let's say, $1.50 per unit down to 10 cents per unit at scale, and it's sustainable and all that good stuff. And your cost of labor, so to speak, per hour is like $1 for 30 sourcing agents. That's pretty impactful to consider. But yeah, it's good stuff. I like to geek out with this, obviously. So keep those questions coming. There's a lot I would love to dive into on the Aura side, the product specifically. Let's see. Tony, another good one here. Is Maven's max price calculated differently as opposed to a non-Maven price strategy max price? Yeah, Casey, you want to hit that?
Yeah, so on your rules-based strategies, that max price is going to be calculated and locked based off of your costs. So if you put in 100% ROI, that's going to be a solid number that Aura can calculate based on those costs. Make sure that that's going to be the higher threshold for you. Since Maven is designed to find that spot that's the best combination of sales speed and margin, that max is going to be a dynamic max. We may have talked about this a little bit earlier today, but essentially as Maven gets more intelligent, learns more about a specific listing, it's going to determine, hey, this is the current best max price. But then if more sellers come in, they raise that max price, or that is no longer considered the optimal max price, or is going to recognize that and adjust accordingly. So that max price that's set by Maven is a little fluent depending on what it's learning from your competition. So it won't be as hard a figure as the rules-based set max, which will be stationary and stagnant, purely based on that cost. Maven will kind of adjust based on the health of that listing, if you will, and the competitors selling on it as well.
Yeah, the way I like to think about this is, again, your min prices are specific to you and your buy cost. Your max prices have nothing to do with you and your buy cost, and everything to do with the economics of each listing, which change moment by moment, right? If you have a 25% increase in competition and therefore supply, in theory, the economics of that just changed. And the inverse is true, right? If you have 50% of your competitors go out of stock, well, if the demand didn't change and the supply went down, your max price should go up in theory, right? And so should your optimal price, right? The target price we're trying to get not only your offer, but the buy box with your offer too. And so what's nice about that is like when you pair Maven and how it's handling that with Hyperdrive, the speed at which you're reacting to this is like less than 10 seconds, right? And people don't think that really matters. But when you think about that over a long enough period of time, over enough SKUs, that adds up. I mean, that could be an extra 5% ROI on average over a month. And you know, depending on what scale you're at, that could be an extra $10,000 in net profit that you got simply because of speed, right? That speed really gets you in the buy box more, right? If you can reprice 12 times in the same time it takes your competition to reprice once, that's more opportunities for you to be in and hold the buy box. So, you know, for us, we really think about the fact that like sellers are struggling with two major things right now is like complexity and speed from a repricing perspective. Maven's going to handle the complexities and then Hyperdrive is going to handle the speed. So those two things together, fantastic, definitely good. But, you know, talking on the Hyperdrive side, you really have to think about like where we can add the most value here, right? Like which SKUs really need that the most. And I think this kind of gets back to like the listing management. You know, we kind of highlighted how to customize and view your listings table in a way that's really useful for you and productive. But part of that is also managing when are you using certain strategies, when are you using certain features like Hyperdrive, right? And really kind of going through and saying, well, which ones need a boost? And the way we think about this is competition, right? Where does speed really add value? That's where we want to target. And so a good way to think about that is what's the number of competitors and then what's the demand on this? If the demand's super high and there's a ton of competition, we're probably going to need some speed, right? If the demand's high and the competition's very low, it wouldn't hurt. But if we have to choose, probably not the best, right? Because like, yeah, it's not going to hurt, but like, is it going to make a meaningful impact on our performance? Not necessarily. You know, a 1%, 2% increase in performance is great, but would you trade that for a 10% increase in performance? Yeah, I kind of would. So you kind of do have to use some critical thinking skills to really understand how you're utilizing these features in a very performant way, right? Like make sure you get the most from it. Nice. Yeah, great question though. I like diving into the depths of Maven. There's definitely a lot there, and I feel like a lot of, especially newer sellers getting into repricing with us, you know, there's kind of this transition of their perspective of what repricing is, right? Because that rule base is very clear cut, right? It's like it's going to follow your settings. There you go, you're done. It's like you have all the control for the most part within the settings available to you. But that also means you really have to understand what you're doing, right? You know, we call them strategies in the industry, but truly they're algorithms, right? We're asking you to create a repricing algorithm yourself. And sometimes you know exactly what to do and you design that custom strategy and you're off to the races, rule-based, it's all good. But a lot of sellers don't have that time or that experience. And Maven's really designed to abstract the complexities away from you so you don't have to think about it. It's like, we already kind of got you covered there, right? Like, and it reduces the friction and the overwhelm, right? But the perspective shift that I'm talking about here is you have to think about the fact that it's handling far more scenarios than the rule-based would. So a lot of people will try to say, well, my rule-based did this, Maven's doing this, why is it different? It's built different. It's designed different, right? Role-based is very target this and here's what to do. Maven's designed to say, well, what's true? And then where do we want to go to that optimal price? Okay, let's look at the optimal price. Let's calculate that dynamic max price. And then what set of behaviors do we need to deploy essentially to get our outcome to occur? And when you first make that transition, it can be like kind of odd or confusing because sometimes Maven may make a decision that you're like, that felt wrong. But then the second decision it made actually made a lot of sense, but it kind of had to position itself. And so you kind of have to take a step back too and be like, well, you know, you might get less repricing events or updates because it's being a little bit more precise, or you might get a little bit more because it's trying to position a little bit better, right? And so you kind of have to expect a shift in how things work but that's not a bad thing. It's just retraining your brain to be like, okay, I kind of have this co-pilot that's watching all the things in real time, and it's going to make changes for me that I would be doing myself manually. Because a lot of work with the rule-based strategies is you're sitting down with 5 strategies, maybe 7 strategies that cover all the unique patterns you've noticed. And you go, cool, what pattern is this listing in? Change the strategy to that pattern. But you're still managing a lot. Whereas Maven can say, well, what's the pattern? I'll make the changes myself. Like, I got this. And I can do it faster than you can, right? Like, if you're sitting down and really like watching and managing your repricing listings, I think you're really missing out on the added value and freedom of go source more, right? You get to free up a lot of your time that was previously used at managing, changing your strategies, all that stuff, to you got it, more complexities, more scenarios than I ever could, as way faster than I ever could, real time. I'm going to go spend those hours sourcing more, hiring more, playing around with new tech, right? Adding new software, whatever makes sense, whatever's the most value add thing for your time. But that's a good place to get to, right? But a lot of people have to make that transition from a perspective. Hopefully that makes sense. Does that make sense, Casey?
Yeah. I was following that. Yeah, I got you. And it is interesting, especially for a lot of our folks who have been with us for a long time, and now they're just starting to use Maven, and it's reacting a little bit differently than they would initially anticipate. I think it is good to emphasize, like you said, if it's making less price changes, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's making changes, learning from those initial changes, and then self-correcting, or hey, that was a good change. Let's double down, maybe make the price a little bit higher, maybe go a little bit lower. So we do maintain the buy box longer. So just the longer it's active on any listing, the more intelligent it's going to become, and then therefore lead to the best results possible for all those listings. And then on the flip side of that coin, if you are just looking to target the buy box, we know a very high percentage of all sales on Amazon come from the buy box. That's where you can go rules based. Make sure that is your sole focus or main goal there. But yeah, situationally, like everything we've been talking about today, nuances, right? It's going to be different for each listing. But yeah, I will double down on the thought of Maven and Hyperdrive equals the best combination of things.
Yes. And one thing to highlight the counterintuitiveness and where you kind of have to make this transition, because I was like, I'm kind of being a little meta here. I want to bring it back to being tactical. We had a user that switched. They're doing a few 100,000 a month in sales. They migrated from legacy Aura to 1.0, and they're used to using rule-based. And like, I really want to go 100% Maven, test this thing out. The thing they did is they transfer the same min values. I think it was 30% ROI from the rule-based to Maven. And like, we're not really seeing the performance we kind of expected. We expected it to go up. I'm like, yeah, it's kind of weird. We've been testing this. It seems pretty great. And I was like, you know what? I do wonder that if the min price is too high, it's actually limiting what the strategies basically Maven can utilize. And so I was like, you know what? Let's test this for a week. If it's not working, we can raise it back up. So we actually lowered the min ROI from 30% to 15%, and the performance went up, right? We're not losing any margin here. Actually, it was completely maintained, but our velocity went back up. And like, that seems counterintuitive. You're like, Dylan, are you telling me to lower my min prices? Maybe. I think you should test with it. And I think this is so important for a mindset shift. Your min prices, a lot of newer sellers go, well, my min price is just where it's going to go. No, it's not. Now, if your strategy is designed to go to your min price, sure, it definitely will. Maven's not designed to do that. One of the things we did in our demo account is we basically put all the SKUs, it's using Maven, 0% ROI. We just want to see, right? Like, what does it all go bad? Not necessarily, right? Because again, you have to ask yourself, what is it targeting? What's the point here? Well, the point is that we're targeting the optimal price, which is not your min price in a lot of cases, unless you have too expensive buy costs, right? And so that's one thing where you kind of have to pause and be like, well, I've always done it this way, but this is a new paradigm. So you kind of have to pause and say, well, is that still true? Is that still the best way for me to do it? So I would urge people to start to slowly pull back on their min prices and see what happens. You might find you're actually doing better. Could even be at a higher margin, which is crazy to fathom, right? But again, if Aura is able to pull the buy box at a slightly lower price and then pull it back up, that's better than it not being able to pull it, period. And so you have to think a little bit more strategically here when it comes to how Aura is going to be repricing. And when that clicks, you're like, all right, cool, makes a lot more sense. I can basically give it less restrictions so that it can do what it's designed to do, right? Whenever we're talking like AI models, you should add some restrictions and limitations to it to get it to do exactly what you want, but it's a law of diminishing returns. Eventually, you add so many limitations that it kind of can't do what it needs to. It defeats the purpose. And in some cases, the min price can be set too high, and you got to pull that back. And all of a sudden, you're like, "Oh, cool, things are taking off. We're pretty good here." So again, things that can feel counterintuitive that actually work. Mins and maxes. We started the conversation with that. Mins and maxes are very similar to that, where it's counterintuitive. A lot of sellers come in when they're brand new and say, "Well, I'm going to set my max prices super high, $1,000." And I go, "Well, why?" Well, because if somebody's willing to pay me $1,000 for this $25 item, I want to be able to take it. Hear the rationale, love it. The reality is nobody's going to do that. And so when you look at something like the oscillation strategy, which we've recommended up until Maven, and it still works. We still recommend it. It's just Maven's better. Not in all cases, but by default. Right? An oscillation is a wave. It goes up and down. And so if the wave is too high, right, it varies too much, meaning that your mins and your maxes are really wide, it defeats the purpose of the strategy. And the strategy is really twofold. It's how do we increase sales velocity? Well, you get in the buy box more. How do you get in the buy box more? You have a better offer. How do you have a better offer? You lower your price by a penny, right? So you do that. And then when you reach your min price, you jump to your max price to basically reset the average net profit per unit, and you reset that whole thing, right? You rinse and repeat. The issue though is that if you set your max price too high and you jump it from, let's say the buy box has been at $25, and you, as an example, have your min price set to 20 and your max price set to 40. So you're going to push it down $5. Too much already. Number two, you're going to jump to 40 and nobody's going to follow you, because most likely they're like, no, you're not going to get that. And you've just pushed the market down. So instead, what you could do is, let's say the buy box kind of averages $25. Let's say the last 90, 180. Take $2 off the bottom, $2 off the top. Add $2 to the top, right? So now we're going to go to 23 at the bottom and go to 27 at the top. Well, that seems weird because you're like, but I'm negating potential sales at 29. Yes. But what you're doing is you're increasing the odds of you actually having a really solid average net profit, which ideally is around that $25 sell price. So you're not pushing the market down too much. $2 is what we're playing with. And when we pop it up, we're actually going to pop up by $4 to that 27. And what's nice there is people will follow you. Other repricing tools will go up with you if they're the lowest one in the buy box now. So it's either the repricing tool, you're using it against itself, or two, it's seller psychology. If you're selling at 23 and you're the only one there, even if you're in the buy box, if you're going to check that listing and see somebody at 27, and what are you going to do? You're definitely going to raise your price. And the moment you do that, we start the process all over again. And so the way I tend to kind of think about this is, as the buy box price increases, so should the range of your mins and maxes, right? So I gave $25, that range, I gave $2 on the bottom, $2 on top. About what I would do. It may take a little bit more, but that's about where I would start. If the buy box is 150, we could take $10 up and $10 down. Now, what I might do is take $10 up, so go to 160 on my max, and maybe only 5 to 10 on the low end. Depends on how much competition we have. But you see how we're already into the nuances of doing this? This is why Maven exists. It's because now you don't really have to deal with it. And now you can say, you know what, that sounds awesome, but I don't want to do that. But I still want the upside of that. Perfect. Switch to Maven. And now we can abstract a lot of that complexities away. And so now we go from that world where we're really trying to constrict the economic factors, variables, what have you, of that listing. We can say, you know what, you deal with that. They change. And this is the thing to keep in mind too. Things change day after day, right? So that $2 down and up may make a ton of sense today, but in 3 days, that may no longer make sense. It may actually make sense to not go $2 up, but go $10 up, because it's a toy and we just transitioned from Q3 to Q4. You see how you have to think about, what are you building and does it scale throughout time, right? Does it change as the economics? And when I say economics, I mean, Are there more sellers on it? That's more supply. Has the demand gone up or down? That changes everything. How's the BSR changing here, right? Where's your units at, right? What's your inventory looking like? And every single seller you compete with, by the way, is in its own life cycle. When you first come into stock, you tend to be way more conservative because you're worried about profitability. As time goes on, opportunity cost increases, excuse me, and long-term storage fees become a real thing. And so you're like, you know what? I don't really care about making money. I want my capital back. Great. So every seller is in a very different, phase of that life cycle when you enter. Everybody's in some different version of that. And the market itself, right? Q4 is a great example of this. Your max price in Q4 for a toy is very different than your max price for that same toy in Q1. I highlight this a ton because I think it's super, super important. That can really lock you in, right? When you go the role-based route, like it's awesome for very specific cases, like what Casey was saying earlier in the conversation of like, you have this exact case you want to handle, perfect. But when you're thinking about handling a lot more complexities, that's when you really want to start thinking Maven. Hopefully that wasn't too much. I just threw at everybody, but this is kind of how I think about it, right?
Yeah, and having a wider min and max range as you kind of climb up and get higher buy box prices for various items, just letting Maven kind of spread its wings a little bit more, giving it more wiggle room to find that optimal price. But obviously, if you have that item, like you said, $25, you don't want to have a min of 15 and a max of 45. That's just way too large. You're going to have Maven still testing within that range, but maybe not testing as intelligently as it could within a tighter range. So yeah, it's all about finding that balance and managing those complexities on the individual listings. And at any given time, I was helping someone today. They're like, "Hey, my price is at $14.50. Doesn't look right." And I jumped in, and as we're looking at it, it went from $14.50 to $11.50. So there's a lot of movement, a lot of price changes in a few minutes. So yeah, it is very situational and based on your competition for sure.
Yeah, you highlighted something there that's important. Like things change really fast, right? So I'm a huge fan of if you're analyzing a specific SKU or listing, enable the auto refresh. Or is going to check for updates every 5 seconds. So it's likely that when you landed on the page and you didn't do that, and it's 5 minutes later, your price could be 12 price changes later, right? So because of that, I always recommend that you enable that when you're deep diving on a listing, because you might be like, right now it's wrong, but in 5 seconds, it could be completely where it should be at, or even better, right? And so what you don't want to do is get caught in taking a snapshot of information of time and be like, this is wrong. Well, actually, it was right, but you didn't look at the second thing that occurred that made it right. So anytime you're looking at data, make it as real time as you can. I know that's hard to do sometimes. Not every system allows you to do that, but it is important to think about what's the frequency of change I can expect in this data. And then based on that, if it's super high, you need more real-time data. If data only changes once a day, do you really need to hit refresh all the time? No, right? Like it defeats the purpose. But if your price can change every 5 seconds or every, less than 10 seconds because you're using hyperdrive and stuff like that, you're definitely going to want that on, because again, when we say that the economics of a listing can change rapidly, it's not just per day, per week, per month. It can be per second in a lot of cases. In a lot of cases where the competition is through the roof and a lot of people on that listing are using repricing tools, you bet there are price changes that are occurring every second, or as close to that as possible. And so when you think about that, it can really change how you view your inventory, how you view your repricing strategies. Because sometimes, again, we can make it super simple. Use a role base, but when you're thinking about the complexities and how fast those change, again, this is why we like to highlight why you should be using Maven with hyperdrive as often as you can, because Maven's awesome, but sometimes you need speed on top of that, right? And when we talk about instant repricing, what that really means for context, we wrote a blog post about this at goaura.com/blog if you want to dive deeper. But just conceptually, instant repricing really just means that in our system, it's immediate. We're not slowing you down. We're not intentionally delaying you because you're not paying us enough. But when we submit it to Amazon, that round trip from when we submit it to when it comes back to us and is confirmed, it's like 1.5 to 2 minutes on average. And that's average, right? So that fluctuates. But hyperdrive allows you to do that in less than 10 seconds for up to 50 SKUs in total on the high end. So sometimes you can get more out of Maven because the amount of price changes that it's able to respond to and how fast it can do that is higher. It's kind of like, I'm not big on analogies here, but it's kind of like playing chess, right? If you're really good at playing chess, you can play a really slow game. But there's a lot of people that play blitz chess, which means you have to be really, really good, really, really fast. And that is a very different kind of performance level. So yeah, super, super important. Awesome. So as we wrap up here for time, we have a handful of minutes here to dive deeper into other questions everybody has. Let's see, Cornelius, are you guys working on conditional rules? I have some stuff that's been stuck in FBA for months and would love if there was a rule that brought old listings to -5 ROI. Good question. Yeah. There's a few ways we could approach this. We're looking at age of inventory as a variable we want to add. There's a few ways we can handle that. One is workflows. So when you say conditional, I start to go to workflows because that's kind of what it's doing, is looking at conditions and making changes. We could very easily say that there's a workflow that says if the age of inventory is greater than X, then what I want it to do is change my strategy from A to B, and B happens to be your liquidation strategy. Additionally, an area that I think is way more interesting is looking at how Maven could do that, right? It might be you say, hey, a day greater than 60, I really want you to get aggressive. And that's an input field that you have. For some sellers, it's 30. For others, it's 90. And you basically being able to say, like, hey, here's kind of how I view. Remember, we talked about this life cycle of products. You basically saying, here's when that life cycle changes for me. Could be day 30, 60, what have you. In which case, Maven would essentially adjust its behaviors to become more aggressive, possibly lower the min price, as an example. So yeah, we are thinking about this. I don't have anything that I can promise you right now, but we are thinking about this because it does come up quite a bit. This age of inventory, factoring that in some case. So yeah, Tony, thank you for the awesome questions. Happy to have you here. It's always nice when we get like a flood of questions, especially a newer seller jumping in and really like deep diving on this stuff. This is awesome. This is exactly what this office hour session is designed for. We could do this kind of stuff. Awesome. So Casey, as we wrap up here, any additional things you want to highlight or add?
Nothing in general. Just to build off of Cornelius's comment, we don't have anything that will do that automatically. You can't set negative ROIs in Aura right now. What I do recommend for folks for liquidation strategies is you can make a strategy that prices, undercuts the competition, whatever those settings look like, but then having the min-max price section at manual, and then setting your minimum price manually to a section that would end up being -5 ROI, working it down. And then you can always decrease that manually set min over time. That's the best way to offload some stale inventory as of now. But yeah, as Dylan, you had mentioned, we are thinking and looking at ways to potentially have that be a more standard built-in setting or option, hopefully sometime in the near future there.
Awesome. Well, we're going to wrap up here. Thank you for everybody joining us. Again, join us next week. We like doing this, right? Ask the same questions next week. That's fine too. We always have new people jumping in. But yeah, hopefully you got a lot of value from this. If you have any additional questions or need help, please reach out to support. Casey and Finn's always there. Bottom right, there's a blue icon. Click that. You can chat directly with us. We have help.goaura.com for different support docs, documentation as well. So if you're learning how to do something or you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're always available. And with that, we will talk to you soon and see you next week. Thanks, guys.
All right, folks. Adios.